I find Yu-Gi-Oh games harder to review than most other games. Biggest reason being, I think people come to the games in the series for some wildly different reasons. Some come expecting a digitization of their favorite paper anime card game, while others come to it as a video game first and a Yu-Gi-Oh simulation second. Dark Duel Stories on the Game Boy Color is probably a game that would appeal to people in both of these imaginary camps. The core gameplay isn't a wild diversion from core Yu-Gi-Oh like something like Forbidden Memories or Duels to the Roses were, but it does take a few shortcuts to smooth things out as a digital experience. One thing to note before I begin here, I will be making a lot of comparisons to the actual rules of Yu-Gi-Oh! So if you aren't familiar with how real Yu-Gi-Oh! Plays, some of the observations I make in the following review will likely not make sense to you. I advise looking up the rules elsewhere before jumping in with me here. You'll want to do that anyway if you're interested in playing Dark Duel Stories because it doesn't really have a tutorial to speak of. So, with that out of the way, does Dark Duel Stories succeed in making a Yu-Gi-Oh! Game worth playing? Or was this earliest Yu-Gi-Oh! Game ever released in North America a poor first attempt? Let's see. Dark Duel Stories' biggest achievement is some of the tasteful modifications it made to Yu-Gi-Oh's core rule set, and some of these changes went on to be inherited by future Yu-Gi-Oh games as well. The most important of which, that really helps with the game's feel, is the lack of phases that divide your turns. In Paper Yu-Gi-Oh, each player's turn is broken down into a couple of different phases that happen at the draw, before combat, during combat, after combat, and at the end of your turn. Having phases such as this when playing in real life doesn't really bog things down too much because most of them are implied and only need to be called out when necessary, such as when you have a magic or trap card that can activate during one of said phases. Some of the games that strictly impose those same exact rules on a digital format can really kill the flow of the pacing. Having to click on a button, pick what phase you want to move into, make your next move, then move into the next phase, it can be a real bummer, especially for a game on a mobile platform like the Game Boy, where you're likely looking for a bite-sized experience. This is not a worry here. Just automatically draw your card at the start of each turn, then play cards and attack in whatever order you deem best, then end your turn when you're finished. Of course, some of the strategy and deliberateness gets lost in this transition, but it balances out because it also opens up new strategies that aren't possible in Paper Yu-Gi-Oh! For example, let's say your opponent has a face-down monster in defense position. In this game, you can try testing the waters by going into attack with one of your existing monsters. Assuming you didn't kill it with that attack, you will now know what monster lies underneath and can play and attack a monster with a type advantage against the defender within that very same turn. This is not possible in Paper Yu-Gi-Oh! Because the battle phase happens once per turn, meaning you would have to play that newcomer prior to you fishing for that information like we did in our example here. And that leads me to my second most impactful change that comes to this game's core rule set, which is how typings are handled. Each monster card in the game is associated with an element, such as Pyro or Forest, and depending on the element they are tied to, will determine where they sit in a huge 10-way rock-paper-scissors match. Thankfully, the type chart is pretty intuitive to remember here. Pyro beats Forest, Aqua beats Pyro, Thunder beats Aqua, and so on. Those two changes are probably the most important things as far as your in-duel changes go. There's some other minor stuff like some cards having their effects adjusted or removed, but more than likely something only a Yu-Gi-Oh! Purist would notice. The rest of the changes and important things that Dark Duel Stories does is stuff that happens outside of the arena. The game is light in the story department. Essentially, you'll be given a screen that shows all available duelists you can challenge at one moment in the story. Click on a duelist to get some brief dialogue about their character, and a duel begins. Beat each duelist 5 times and you will get presented with a new screen of duelists to repeat the process until you've completed all the challenges the game has to offer. The format of challenging duelists is one that lacks flair, but remains engaging because of all the different progression hooks that get thrown at you. Your deck will grow in power in a variety of ways after each duel, making the game feel like a very light RPG at points. The most obvious way that this occurs is by the acquisition of brand new cards. Each Duel 1 means that one more card gets added to your library that you could potentially slot into your 40 card deck. You start out with relatively weak cards, so by comparison, the random card drops will more than likely be upgrades to your puny starter deck. Each win also nets you an increase in your deck level. Each card has an associated cost with it for keeping that card inside of your deck. The total cost of all cards in your deck cannot exceed your total deck level. This deck building limitation imposed on you will force you to get crafty with what cards you want to bring into battle with you. I really like this system because it gives purpose to otherwise insanely weak cards that would never ever see play in the real game, because their extremely low stats also corresponds to an extremely low cost here, which frees you up to put beefy high cost monsters elsewhere in your lineup. I found that my more optimized late game deck would splash at least one or two of these super weak early game cards for each type in the game. This allowed me to have a diverse set of types at my disposal to respond to whatever my opponent had in play, while still allowing me to have a core set of strong monsters that were type agnostic to chip away at my enemy life points. The last major way in which progression will keep you coming back is with one of Dark Duel Stories' most interesting new mechanics, card construction. At the end of each duel, you will get not only the previously mentioned card, but also a card part. This card part will be a random upper or lower body, and you can mix and match these different pieces when you're building your cards to create monsters that are perfect for your strategy. I would often go into card construction after a tough loss to create a card with a type I was looking for to be better prepared for my next encounter. They even have the card artwork update depending on which combination of torso and legs you use, and I have created some seriously crazy looking monstrosities. The construction is definitely a positive addition to the game because of the extra level of freedom it gives you, but one of the downsides with it is that it probably doesn't go as far as I would have liked it to. The customization abilities only extend as far as the attack and defense of the card, the type of the card, the amount of offerings needed for it to be put in play, and the artwork. There isn't the ability for these custom cards to have effects of their own like some of the regular cards in the game do, which is definitely kind of a bummer. What's a little more than just a bummer that plagues the entirety of Dark Duel Stories is the user interface. Now, during combat, the UI isn't horrible. For the amount of information that needs to be displayed, this Game Boy Color game does an okay job. It's certainly on the dull side, but it is completely functional. That's not the case with the deck building and card construction menus. There are no sorting options that you can impose on either of these screens, which means that you'll be thumbing through page after page of cards in your library to get what you want. Most of what you're combing through are actually going to be empty slots because it doesn't even let you filter down to just your owned cards. The construction screen is the exact same deal. Just flip through unowned part after unowned part until you finally see a little star indicating that you've actually found something worth looking at because you actually own it. These lack of organizational tools feels like they could have been a really easy addition, which makes their exclusion feel really inexcusable. While I'm still on the topic of negatives, I'll get one final one out of the way, and that's the AI. The AI has an extreme tendency to prioritize cards with the highest level, not necessarily cards with the best types against my monsters or with the highest attack. This quirk led to some weird scenarios where my opponent would give up a board state that I had literally no way of beating because of its absolute necessity to get out the highest level monster it possibly could. It's worth noting that I didn't notice this poor AI until very late into my experience on the game's final and second final boss fights, where things are a little more stacked against you, because for the first 5 hours, it was relatively imperceivable. Dark Duel Stories was overall still a very enjoyable experience for me. What makes the game such a smooth play is that the difficulty curve feels exactly how it should be, a curve, rather than walls being dropped in front of you at varying points of the playthrough, which is a phenomenon I've certainly felt in other Yu-Gi-Oh games. The new idea it brings to the table with card construction is a win, and emphasizes the modularity and customization that I love so much about card games in the first place. The game's got its negatives, but thankfully most of them exist at the extremities of the experience and don't impact the core dueling fun and progression that kept me wanting to do just one more duel. Regardless of how much of a duelist you are, I would recommend giving this game a shot if you have even the most cursory interest in it. I think you'll walk away feeling that this duel story really isn't that dark after all.